Welcome back to the Tech Collective, everyone. I'm Dippin with CE Critic, here with my co-host Scott. How's it going, Scott?
Good. How you doing?
I'm doing well. So for those of you that are new to CE Critic, Scott and I have over 4 decades of experience inside of the tech industry, and today we're going to have a really fun deep dive into bookshelf speakers.
Yeah, in case you're new to the Tech Collective, every week Dippin and I discuss what's up in tech news, and then we delve deeply into a particular technology related topic. So sometimes we bring in other industry experts to make it a roundtable, but for this week's episode, it's just going to be the two of us because we both have a lot to say about this topic.
That's right. So not only will you hear a lot about bookshelf speakers this episode, just in case you happen to be in the market and are looking to buy bookshelf speakers, but you also get a look behind the scenes on how professional reviewer Scott evaluating the products and how these articles actually get written. But before we jump down this really deep rabbit hole, let's chat about a couple of tech stories from last week. Scott, what really stuck out to you from all the stories that happened last week?
Well, there are some interesting ones. I think one thing first, just to follow up on a story from last episode, it turns out that Sennheiser is going to be selling the 6XX headphone. We had talked about this in the previous episode, how there's a big, I don't know if uproar is quite the word, but there were a lot of disappointed audiophiles or wannabe audiophiles who couldn't buy the 6XX. As a tribute, I actually happen to be wearing my set of 6XX right now, just to show how happy I am that they're back on the market. So for just over $200, I think it's like 220. It looks like you are able to purchase right from Sennheiser, which is an interesting move because it's not a knockoff, but it's like a collaboration that somebody else was selling, and now Sennheiser is selling their own collaboration. So that's an interesting move. What do you think about that as a move?
I think that's great. I mean, the industry loves this. They're a darling for most people to recommend as an entry level headphone and for someone to jump into the head-fi space or the audiophile space. So this is really, really great that they're keeping it going. I think last time we checked on the Mass website, there was over 100,000 people waiting to order these, wanting to know what happened. So obviously the financials are going to make sense for Sennheiser as well. But I'm happy to see that they're keeping the headphones in the market. They're going to still continue to produce them. And when I looked on places like Reddit and AVS Forum, and people were really happy that they're still available and they're still going to be out there for people to grab.
Well, speaking of keeping things on the market, my top story for this week, for new news, is that Samsung is apparently taking their Z TriFold off the market. So the triple folding phone, the one that folded out into a 10-inch tablet, uh, it just went up a few months ago, and it just struck me as odd because the story that I read about on Digital Trends was saying that we're not sure what's going to happen, but it seems like Samsung may be working on a sequel to this, maybe a Trifold 2 or some other take on it on the technology. So it seemed odd to have it up for just a little bit, take it down, and then still be working on the, like, why wouldn't you leave it up and then still be working on it? These are $2,900 phones, and I don't know how many they have lying around the warehouse, but that seems like a really big thing to punt. Like just a few months ago, Samsung had reached out to me to offer me a press trip to go out to CES, which I was already going to go out to, but they were going to pay for all my stuff, my expenses, and I didn't wind up going on the trip. But all that to say, like they were clearly willing to spend money on that, on advertising. They were going full bore, and then all of a sudden it's like, no, we're done. So what's your take on this? Because it just seems really weird to me.
So if I put on my business hat for this, this seems just like a manufacturing shift. Whatever they want to do for the Gen 2, they needed to stop the manufacturing, fix the tooling, adjust the tooling, whatever they needed to do there. And in order to do that, they had to say, okay, we can no longer produce these. And thus, 3 months later after launch, they're saying, yeah, these are going away. um, because we don't see the sales numbers in these, or how well they're selling, but that's what makes me think they're switching strategies pretty quickly here, because one quarter isn't really enough to know what the market thinks about it, unless none of their vendors are buying, right? Because Samsung sells to places like Verizon and AT&T and all these companies. If all these companies are showing slow demand and are saying, nope, we're not going to be ordering any of these or stocking any of these, that could have also informed their decision. But based off a couple of the articles I also read around this, I think it has a lot more to do with they're making a big product shift. They got to redo some of their tooling and their manufacturing, and they're just not going to be able to continue to manufacture the Z Fold in its current form. So they're just going to pull it off the market. And actually, I applaud Samsung for doing this, because it takes a lot of backbone to make such a dramatic shift so quickly after a product is launched. So I appreciate that they're looking at the sentiment, looking at what fits in the market, and are able to pull back and say, okay, we got to pivot, shift directions. Let's pull this off the market.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of our viewers are probably too young to recognize this metaphor, but it strikes me as like in the old days of printed newspapers when someone would yell, "Stop the press!" It's like you finally just got all the stories together. You finally got it printing. It's the whole machine is going, and then they yell, and there's a big grinding halt. They're like, "What? What is it? What is it?" And like once you stop that press, it takes a long time to get back that momentum.
It
So
does.
I'm curious. That was my top story for the week. What's your top story for the week?
Okay, mine I'm really excited about. Let me just pull this up on the screen for us as well so everyone can see it. I love collecting physical media. So I have my Blu-ray collection, I have vinyls. So I was super happy to see that the vinyl sales in 2025 topped over $1 billion. We saw this gradually go up over the last several years, or actually a better part of a decade. And over COVID, when everyone was stuck at home and people started looking at their hi-fi systems or whatever system they had in their house, they started collecting a lot more vinyl, not just for aesthetic purposes, but to actually listen to. So I was really happy to see that vinyl sales are going up again, and that people are collecting, and that we topped over $1 billion, because I'm a huge fan of physical media, as I said, and I want to make sure that these formats continue to stay. Because in the streaming world, you never know when things are going to be pulled off, when they're going to switch, what platform has what music. So I like the idea of just buying what you have. You have that existing piece of media forever, and it's yours and you own it. It reminds me of, Star Wars, where people are like, I want the original cuts of like The New Hope or some of these movies before George Lucas started messing around and putting in little edits. The only way to save it is to have its own physical copy, and a physical copy that you have in your house. What do you think about this, Scott?
It's interesting as you talk about it. Like I know that people have argued like, oh, analog for the sound quality is better than CDs. Uh, but the thing that people can debate that, but the thing that you can't debate is that vinyl is an experience. And the main experience is somebody who is going to have a physical record, put it on. It's very purposeful. And I was actually talking to, I was at my son's hockey game yesterday, and I was talking to a couple of the dads, and I said, "Hey, does anybody have like a spare record player? Because I'm actually working on an article that I think we're going to be talking about in just a minute." I said, "Hey, does anybody have a spare record player?" He said, "Actually, I do have a spare." And what I love about it is that when I put it on, I'm putting on a whole album. I'm not skipping around. I'm not doing a playlist. I'm not doing something else. It could be background music. He's not necessarily just sitting there just doing that, but it's a very purposeful thing. Whereas I think a lot of other audio is just sort of the audio is a distraction, or it's in the background, and it's not as purposeful. But there's something like a, you can't take that away from me vibe I think that vinyl has, where I'm going
Yeah.
to put on a record, I'm going to listen to it, and I'm going to experience something. The interesting thing is that he said that he had just bought a set of Kef LS50 Metas for his father for his 70th birthday. And so I thought, oh, that's so interesting because I'm looking at those very speakers for this article I'm working on for Business Insider.
So, Scott, you just quickly mentioned that article you're working on for Business Insiders. Can you give us a little bit more about the genesis of that and what we're going to be talking about here?
Yeah, so it was one of the first things we wound up talking about as we were starting to talk about like what should we do on the show because Business Insider, my editor, reached out to me and said, "Hey, I have two articles. One of them was about bookshelf speakers." And he said, "Hey, do you want to do a buyer's guide on bookshelf speakers?" And so I had to very quickly think about like what do I know about them and then what do I not know? And then like you said earlier, it's a rabbit hole. It is like once you jump in, just figuring out what is a bookshelf speaker and then why are people so interested in using them because there's a similar sort of a thing going on with vinyl where it's like, well, if you know, you know. If you know
Yeah.
that two-channel audio is so good, from the two speakers, we call it two-channel audio, then people who know like bookshelf speakers over sound bars. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The real genesis of the article of but I'm getting ahead of myself. The real genesis of this whole article was an editor reached out to me and said, "Would you like to do a buyer's guide of bookshelf speakers?" And I said, "Yes, definitely." And so I started doing the research. And then the more I started asking you questions, you kept saying, like, "Oh, actually, we should save this for the show." So we're finally here to the show.
Yeah.
So I'm very excited. I'm going to get some of my questions answered.
Okay, awesome. So let's dive into this into the article, and I also want to frame this around someone is looking to buy bookshelf speakers, what considerations they should have. And by the way, if you've already owned bookshelf speakers or you're looking to be a first time buyer of bookshelf speakers, I think somebody will get a little bit of different things out of this conversation. So listen to this whole thing all the way through, and before we get really deep, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe and that bell so you can be notified of more episodes coming up. So Scott, let's dive into this. Where would you like to start? As the journalist who is writing this article, where would you like to start the conversation around bookshelf speakers?
The first part is literally just let's define what bookshelf speakers are. So for me, what I have found is that there are certain conditions that need to be met. Bookshelf speakers, they're named that because they might fit on a bookshelf, which is it's a bit of a misnomer because eventually when people do buy bookshelf speakers, they don't always go on a bookshelf. It's more just talking about the size of the speakers. But the thing that I found that bookshelf speakers have in common is they're usually sold as a pair. They are not floor standing speakers, so you wouldn't put them down on the floor. They tend to be about, you know, 10 to 12 inches tall. And um, then that's where we get into like what makes different bookshelf speakers different. But it seems like those are the things. What else would you add to that about what makes something a bookshelf speaker?
Just the definition. Some people call it bookshelf speakers, some people call it stand mounts. Depends on what part of the world you're in, but they're both the
Yeah.
exact same thing. And that's exactly right. They're usually smaller in form factor, and they're not going to sit on the floor unless you have a stand underneath it or something else propping it up. It's really, we can talk about the size because there are some really big speakers that are still defined as bookshelf speakers. Um, but you really want to you can tell by when you look at them. We'll have some pictures of some b-roll up here, but people will be able to tell what a bookshelf speaker is. I think it's also important to quickly mention monitors and studio monitors. A lot of studio monitors are bookshelf speakers, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit later down the line, but over the last, I'd say, probably almost 10 years, we've seen this line blur between studio monitors and bookshelf speakers. You're seeing a lot more people inside of the studio space using bookshelf speakers instead of dedicated monitors. And there's a difference for those as well. A lot of it has to do with the design of the speakers, the use case, and the connections on the back. but we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here. But that's where I would stick for the basic definition as people are shopping.
Yeah. I've found that a lot with bookshelf speakers, that there are a lot of these, it goes this way, but not that way. So, like, you can put bookshelf speakers on a desk, but they're different from desktop speakers. Desktop speakers tend to be more like, this is what I'm putting on either side of my computer or computer monitor. And they tend to be smaller, but you can actually have, what are normal size bookshelf speakers are big for desktop speakers. So that's all relative. And then the thing with monitors is a really good point, because a traditional monitor, like that a producer or somebody who's mixing or an editor might use, they might only use one monitor, where other people who are professionally mixing might use a set of headphones, or they might use, now it sounds like you're saying that, like, people are using two two speakers as opposed to just one monitor. So there are a lot of interchangeable terms. So somebody could use the term monitor to refer to bookshelf speakers, and then they could also refer to them as stand mounts, and they could also refer to them as, I don't know, small speakers. There's a few different terms in there. So hopefully we can be consistent and everybody knows what we're talking about.
I think so. Um, okay, so what would be the next question for you as you're thinking about your article here?
The very next, after defining what it is, the very next thing, I always jump to use case. Like, what are people actually using these for? And for bookshelf speakers, it's what I would describe this as either near field or filling up a room, meaning that if somebody has them on a desktop, then they're not going to be playing them as loud because they're right there, but they still want the quality of the bookshelf speakers. So that's near field. And then filling up a room, I just mean that the bookshelf speakers are placed somewhere that you can hear it from anywhere in the room. It's not like loudspeakers, I would say, where they're meant to fill up the whole house or multiple rooms. It's still fairly close, but it's more of filling up what I would say is like a small to medium sized room. Does that seem fair?
That seems fair. I mean, you can definitely go bigger. I mean, there's a lot of subjectivity around room sizes, so I'll throw in a couple of what I would consider real room sizes. But the bookshelf speakers are the most versatile. Like you said, you can put them on a table, you can put them on your computer desk, and you can put them in a home theater setup. But depending on the size, right, they'll fit anything up to, let's say, um, a 300 or 400 square foot room, all the way up to 1,000 square feet rooms, right? When you start to
Oh
get
wow.
to, yeah, and it all depends on how somebody wants to listen, right? And how loud they can go. If you look at something like Key Audio, they build amazing active book. They still consider bookshelf speakers, but those things can really push out a lot of air and really fill in a room. You're also paying a very hefty price for that level of quality, but that's where a lot of the versatility comes in of the size versus a floor standing speaker where you can get as big as you want, right? There's floor standing speakers that are 12 feet tall that will fill up an entire room, right? I'm thinking of things like Wilson Audio, which are just massive, or you get stuff like from Kef, or you even get what are the speakers? You can get line array speakers. I mean, these bigger speakers are designed for bigger spaces, but when you're talking
And
about,
bigger wallets.
and, well, sometimes I mean, bookshelf speakers can get up there in price and get there up there in expense, right? Like once you get into
Yep.
hi-fi space, spending $10,000-15,000 on a pair of bookshelf speakers is not unheard of, right? Very expensive, but also not unheard of.
Yep. So you mentioned setting up bookshelf speakers for movies. That is one use case where if somebody leans more towards, like, hey, we just want good quality audio for movies, and I don't want to mess with a sound bar, I don't want to mess with all sorts of surround speakers and all that. Some people just like two bookshelf speakers. Ostensibly, if they're watching for movies, they're probably going to want to set up a subwoofer also. Um, but having bookshelf speakers is something that's versatile. So let's just get into it. What about bookshelf speakers versus sound bars? Because I think that's one of the things where people are like, well, wait a minute, you've been telling us that we're supposed to get sound bars because TV speakers are awful, so we should get a sound bar, right? So why would
Yeah.
somebody get this kind of a setup, bookshelf speakers over a sound bar?
Great question. So bookshelf speakers, in my opinion, will probably almost always sound better than a sound bar until you start to get to the really higher end sound bars. And let's say you have a really higher end sound bar, it's like two, three, $4,000 versus an entry level bookshelf speaker with a receiver or integrated amp. Then you're like, give or take on the sound quality. But if you're comparing apples to apples, if you got $3,000 to spend on your system here, and you have to pick between a sound bar and bookshelf speakers, bookshelf speakers are going to be better all the time. And the main reason for it is just, what makes good sound. And in my opinion, and I think a lot of people will agree here, is when you have good sound, it's the space around that helps something sound good. So when you have a compact soundbar where everything is coming from one place, there's a lot of things that those companies are doing, right? They're adding DSP, they have multiple drivers, they're trying to have each driver have different responsibilities, but you still sort of feel limited in that space. Once you get bookshelf speakers and you can start moving things around, the soundstage opens up. In my opinion, you get better imaging, you get much better depth in the music or movie that you're watching. And then, of course, like you mentioned before, I would always recommend a subwoofer with any setup and try to put that into your system. So, in order, right? TV speakers are the absolute worst. Avoid them at all cost. Soundbar is going to work really great if you're in a compact situation or you don't have the space for bookshelf speakers or you just want something that's simple and plug and play that you can just put on a mantle or put on your entertainment center. Great. It's going to outperform the TV every single time. And then if you want to level up, you go to bookshelf speakers and have that really nice setup in your living room space, and it becomes even more versatile than a soundbar can be. I think a lot of people will talk about, oh, then you're not getting Dolby Atmos or DTS-X or some of these other encodings, but without going too far deep into that conversation, you're not really getting those anyway with a soundbar, right? You're getting the container of which something is encoded and decoded, but to get a proper Atmos effect or DTS-X effect, you need separates. You need a room that can support it. Companies can try to simulate it as much as they want from a single soundbar, but you can't. That's why the higher end soundbars all have rear speakers that come with them because you need that physical separation of the speakers placed in specific parts of the room to get a proper effect. But if you're only talking about the front center and the front stage over there with bookshelf speakers versus sound bars, bookshelf speakers are going to win every single time, in my opinion.
Yeah, and you raise a few good points. I think I wanted to make sure that we definitely highlight what I think is the most important thing there, which I agree with you. There's all sorts of fancy digital trickery to make it sound like things are coming from around you. And I've heard some amazing things. I mean, I've heard there's some sound bars out now that legitimately there's a company called Audio Scenic. Are you familiar with
I'm
them?
not familiar with them.
Um, they are the technology behind like Razer has a sound bar, and there's some different monitors that they work with, like Acer.
Okay.
So they built these speakers that it really does feel like 5.1, but it's coming from right in front of me. And they're using like a camera or something locked into my eyes so it can tell what's a surround for me. So there is really cool technology out there. But having said that, there's no Atmos that I've heard that's just as good as having actual speakers above my head. You can make it sound like the things are coming from over your head, but it's not the same. And the same with sides or rear speakers. So having distinct separate speakers, that's the ultimate. And so that's the big thing that bookshelf speakers do, is they move the sound outward, and whatever it is going to sound better. And there are things that can sound similar, and when you're doing surround sound or Dolby Atmos or DTS, whatever, there are things that sound very good. And another point I want to make is we're not knocking sound bars. Like, what they do is great, and some of what they do is incredible. I mean, just the number of speakers that they have in such a small container is great. But if what you're looking for is a particular sound, if you're looking for a huge sound stage, you just can't compete with having separate speakers.
That's right. And there's so much that goes into picking a soundbar. Excuse me, picking a speaker over a soundbar. I mean, that's where I think um, complexity comes in. So soundbar is great if you just want a little bit more plug and play. I know we're going to talk a little bit more about passive and active speakers, but soundbars can be a little bit more plug and play, easy to set up. You got one HDMI coming from the TV into the soundbar, you plug it in, and most people are pretty well set up there. Whereas once you start to get bookshelf speakers, it does add an extra layer of complexity that some people may not want to jump into.
So yeah, that's a good point about passive versus powered, because that's really the next rabbit hole to jump into. So passive are what I would call traditional speakers, where you have two binding posts, like you have a red one and a black one, and you plug in that wire, but they need power. Whereas powered speakers have power built into it, meaning
Correct.
that they have amplifiers built into the speakers to help power them. So let's get the ball rolling here. I think you'd be good to talk about some of this stuff. Why do people There are people who very strongly advocate for passive speakers versus powered speakers. I know we talked last week about future proofing,
Yeah.
and so passive is a good way to go, because as amplifying technology gets different, you can level up your components and so forth. So what are some of the things that why somebody would advocate for passive versus powered, and then vice versa?
Great question. So passive is all about control and how much control you want to have over your system. Well, when you pick the passive speakers that you like, and there's so many different designs out there of different types of materials people are using, whether it's a two-way speaker or a three-way speaker. There's a lot of flexibility in what you can pick from a passive speaker. But then it comes down to what type of components you want to put to it, right? Some people are very much into tube amps and they want to have tube amps with their products. Others are into, solid state amplifiers, but they only want class AB. They're like, I will never put in class D amplifiers, or sometimes even class G, like companies like Anthem that uses that. So it's really a matter of having control over your system a little bit more. And it gives people the opportunity to try different amplifiers with their system and see what they like. Whereas on the active side, then you really have the opportunity to just plug and play. It's engineered to work completely differently than a passive speaker, and I'll speak to that in just a moment. But people are able to just set it up, work with an app, use some DSP controls to make it sound good in your room, and then they're off to the races, and they don't have to put too much thought into it. Um, when you're talking from the engineering standpoint, which is what I just mentioned, it's really interesting because passive speakers are a little bit harder for engineering teams to make because they've got to account for a lot more variety out in the market because they don't know what you're going to pair those speakers with. So they need to make sure that they have the appropriate amount of crossovers, where the crossovers are set. Whereas in an active system, the engineers can control every aspect of that speaker. They can even put a digital crossover in later down the chain versus a passive crossover. They can really drive the speaker to perform at a level that was very unique to the size of the box, the size of the drivers, and they can do a lot of different things when it comes to making that speaker. The trade-off becomes is it comes to a dollar standpoint because you can have a passive speaker that, let's say, is $2,000, and you might even spend another $2,000 powering it, and so you're in the system for about $4,000. Whereas on an active side, you can have a system that will be a little bit less. It might cost you $2,500 or $3,000, and it can perform to the same levels. The problem becomes is what we talked about in our previous episode with future proofing is that you can't switch your equipment down the line. You've got to replace the whole system in an active setup. So if you love the sound of those speakers, you might be a firmware update behind, and or the company might stop supporting firmware updates on that speaker, and you're kind of stuck with what you've got. Whereas passive speakers will last you decades upon decades.
Yeah, and so it's as with many things, whenever I see people on both sides of an issue, it basically comes down to trade-offs. So, do you want the longevity and the flexibility and the control of passive speakers, or do you want the simplicity and I guess the ease of use of powered speakers. Because the key thing, and we've referred interchangeably, they're called powered or active speakers. So whenever we refer to that, that's what we mean. It means that there's power coming into the speaker that you have to actually plug it in, which has some obvious implications with where you position them. We haven't gotten into positioning yet, but that's a key thing with bookshelf speakers. So
That's
um,
right.
with powered speakers, what I always think is first that the engineers, instead of having to wonder what are people going to use, then they know exactly what amplifier is going to be used because they build it into the speaker and they paired it to work very well with the speaker. So there's like less human error. So I like that, but I always feel like I don't know. There's some sense of FOMO with powered speakers. It's like I'm giving up something, maybe in the flexibility or something. And so it's a double-edged sword for me with powered speakers.
Yeah, and again, it comes down to the setup. I mean, in a lot of desktop situations, like power speakers, or where a lot of folks are usually using them. Now we're seeing a lot more people using them in living room setups, and you're seeing a lot more power speakers with an eARC input on them. But it's just a matter of flexibility and how much setup you want to do. And I'll also make the case where if you're willing to put in the effort and put in a little bit of elbow grease between shopping for deals and looking for Facebook Marketplace deals of used products, you can put together a really killer system without breaking the bank. But again, it just comes down to that effort, right? Some people just want that plug and play setup and call it a day. I come from the background because I come from the audio industry where I think it's fine to constantly just check your setups and hey, let me just go try this amplifier and see if I like it a little bit better or something new came out. And I have the advantage of where I have a phenomenal dealer down the road. I'll just plug him. It's Modus AV down here in Swanee, Georgia. He's got an amazing setup. So I'm constantly bothering him and saying, "Hey, I heard you got some new stuff in. Can we come and have a listen?" And he's like, "Yeah, come on down." So just being in the space does require that amount of investment of listening to different gear, listening to different pairings, and seeing what you actually like from a personal setup. So
And
there
and yeah, like
trade-offs.
like we said in the future proofing episode, it's important to keep in mind what's the end game. Like what am I trying to get to? And then realize that in a lot of situations you can sort of build a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time, and just refine and say like, what am I not willing to live without right now, and what can I wait on?
Exactly. Exactly.
So that actually brings me to an interesting question. I saw something. I've seen a few things in my research as I've gone down the rabbit hole. One of them was double binding posts.
All right.
I didn't even know that this was a thing. So can you describe, instead of having one set of red and black inputs in the back, there are two on each speaker. So why is that happening, and why should I care? And is that better?
No, it's not better. It's just a matter of power. Sometimes, I'll say for 95, maybe even 99% of the people out there, you're only going to ever plug in one set of speaker wires to the back of your terminal there. The companies that put in two just have it so people have flexibility for that small minority who might want to put in two amplifiers. So, most people get stereo amplifiers, which means left and right power going to left and right speaker. Some people get mono blocks, which means it will only power one speaker. So they'll have, let's say, two mono blocks with a right speaker and two mono blocks with a left speaker. The real use case is the only time I've actually seen it where somebody made a really big deal about it was they really wanted the highs and the tweeters to be powered by tubes and valve amplification, and they wanted the low end to be powered by solid state, so they still got that solid state thump. And this was in a three-way speaker. That's the only time it made sense to me. I never actually listened to a setup like that. It was just the way somebody was describing it online, but almost 99% of people just one set of speaker wires to the back of the bookshelf speakers and you're good to go.
So that from a practical standpoint, if you see double binding posts, you just turn and run the other way, or do you go, okay, that's something I can deal with, but let's further look into the speaker?
It's not even something you need to deal with. It's just treat the two sets of binding post, the double binding post on the back of the speakers the same way you would treat a single post, and you'll be fine. Right?
Because
Don't
there's
overthink it.
something that sort of bypasses that, right?
Well, it depends. There's jumper cables that you can put on the outside. Some speaker companies have internal connections with little knobs in the middle. But as far as actually powering the speakers, don't give it too much of an extra thought. There's no reason for it to be a problem, and for most people's use cases, it's going to be perfectly fine. If you're at the point where you're putting different types of amplifiers to the different binding posts on a pair of bookshelf speakers, you're already down a different rabbit hole and have a different knowledge level that you'll know exactly what you want to do because you're looking for very specific setup and criteria. And you're usually working with a local dealer who's going to help you out, anyways.
Gotcha. Well, I guess in that case, you're dealing with a rabbit with multiple holes, but
Yeah,
that's a separate story. Um, excuse me. So I think my concern is that somebody is going to maybe hear what we're saying or already be doing their own research, and then they hear something like, "Oh, this particular speaker," and I can't think of one off the top of my head. I think there's a Klipsch. I don't know if the RP600M has double binding posts, but there was some clips that I was looking at that I thought, oh, this is a very highly recommended speaker. So now what do I do with this information? Do I keep moving forward and just ignore the fact that it has that and I'll just amplify it the way I want or whatever? It
exactly.
sounds like it's just sort of move on is the like keep going. And if the speaker works, then you can just amplify it regular. You don't need multiple amplifiers.
Yeah, exactly. It's like specialized use cases, and Klipsch is a good example because I think next we're going to start talking about how to power the speakers and sensitivities.
Yep.
But Klipsch is a perfect example because they have such high sensitivity. They're very easy to drive speakers. They're usually like around 95, sometimes even 98 dB for sensitivity. I mean, that basically
Yep.
means you can like plug a Klipsch speaker into a potato and it will play music, right? They're so easy to drive. Um,
Yep.
but I think that brings us to the next point that we kind of put here in our notes, which is where we start talking about amplification about these speakers. In your article, I know we kind of talked about this a little bit offline, but just to bring it here into the show, have you picked an amplifier yet that you're going to get to test all these speakers with, or have you thought about that?
I've thought about that. It's an interesting question. I was talking with my buddy Adam, the one who got the Kefs for his dad.
Okay.
He was saying that he got a Blue Sound Power Node Edge,
Yeah.
which I think is one of the ones I was considering. I'm also looking at Wim, so I was thinking maybe a Wimamp Pro or Ultra. And the reason I was looking at those is that I've heard mixed things. I've heard on the one hand, it's sort of like the same discussion as the powered versus passive. It's like some people are really snobby about like, I want this type of amplifier. You mentioned AB and you mentioned D.
Yeah.
So when it comes to amplifiers, I think there's a question of like, is it better to have a clean sound? Is it, do you want your amplifier? Because all amplifiers provide power, but some actually do affect the sound, and some are more analytical and just provide clean power and make things louder. And some tend to be more warm and actually affect the personality of the music going through. So that's what I wanted to talk about with this. So, how would you characterize AB versus D in those regards?
Yeah. So it's completely different engineering. So I'll use the car analogy here, right? Like AB is pure horsepower, right? So you're think of like a sports car with a naturally aspirated like V8 or V10 engine, like just pure grunt and power. And let's say they're putting out 500 watts, right? Then a class D can still put out that 500 watts, but they're going to use different engineering, right? It may be supercharged V6, or there might be other engineering um, aspects that they're using. And if you're, I'm using cars as an example, but if you're used to driving those two type of cars, even though both cars put out, 500 watt, or excuse me, 500 horsepower, it's they still behave differently in the way that the power gets to the road, to the tires, through the transmission. All of that changes. um, this is where actually the speakers come first in the setup, and why amplification kind of comes second, because you need to pick what type of speakers you want, what type of speakers you like the sound for, because what I was just mentioning about impedance, that's going to tell you how much horsepower you need and what type of horsepower you need to drive those speakers, because the job of the amplifier is to control the speakers, right? And the better it can do that, the better the speakers can perform when they're playing music. So, we mentioned KEF a little bit earlier. KEF are very hard to drive, right? The reason KEFs sound so good is part of it's because they're hard to drive. So when you're looking at speakers that are 89 dB, 87 dB, right, that means you're going to need a lot more power to get to the same SPL level in the room and to get the same level of output you're looking for. Whereas, like I said, the clips are much easier to drive. That's why you see a lot more clips with receivers, because typically receivers have Class D amplifiers. And by the way, just in case anyone's interested, I did a whole video on how receiver manufacturers align to you in their specs on how much power it actually produces. But clips are very easy to drive, and similar speakers like that at 95 dB in sensitivity. So plugging them in with a receiver, they typically sound great. Whereas with something like a KEF or Bowers and Wilkins, those type of speakers need a lot more power to control the speakers to sound really great. And that's where you might want to head over to more of an AB type of speaker. Now, the trick here, and this is where things get very difficult, is you're not going to know the difference until you listen to it side by side. So getting an opportunity to demo them, you're going to be able to hear the different things that the speakers do and how they behave. Which I'm going to take a little bit of a side tangent here, if everyone will stick me. There is a very simple way to demo speakers and listen to speakers. I know people overcomplicate things. It just takes a little bit of effort. What you need to do is just find a handful of tracks that you know exceptionally well, that you really like. And what you want to listen for in the speaker is, how well does it reproduce the song? Are the guitar strings sounding very vibrant in the room, or do they sound flat or dead? Does the vocals sound good? Does the sound stage, is the singer dead center in the sound stage? Are they off to the right? Are they off to the left? What's happening with the depth? Where is the drummer place? Whatever type of music you're listening to, that will tell you how well the speakers are performing. But you just have to get exceptionally familiar with that piece of music. And then within 10 minutes, you can demo any set of speakers. And so when you're listening to the speakers, now you know what the speakers can do. Then when you add the amplifier to it, the amplifier will control the speakers on, okay, how well does it control the speakers so that it can create a great sound stage, or the guitar strings sound as accurate as they're supposed to sound, and this, and it feels like someone's in the room with you versus listening to a recording. So what's really hard for you in doing your roundup is that you're going to have such a variety of speakers that have so many different power needs. um, what I would recommend is you pick one of the amplifiers that you want, whether it's the Blue Sound or it's the Whim, and you have to stick to that one throughout the entire demo session, which means listen to all the speakers with that same amplifier, let your ears rest for a day, and then maybe come back the next day and listen to all those speakers again with the Win amplifier, and then you'll know exactly what each one is doing.
Yeah, that's one of the things that's in my plans. It's like you read my playbook, even though I know you haven't. Um, that's one of the biggest things in audio is that most of the things, almost everything sounds good until you compare it to something else. The little earbuds you get on the plane for free or $5, whatever, those will sound good until you put them up against anything else. But it's always the comparison, and it's really important to be consistent. That's why the thing that I struggled with is that I'm blessed with the opportunity to have more expensive amps, and there are some folks out there who have said like, "Oh, we'll send you this amp. It's like $1,000, $2,000." And I have mixed feelings because it's like ultimately I want to know what the speakers are capable of because that's what it's about. But I'm trying to keep it like Blue Sound or Whim are both the kinds of solutions I think most people are going to look at. So whether they're the perfect pairing for the speakers I'm getting, like
Yeah.
maybe let's say, one of those amps would pair very well with the Kef, but not with the Klipsch, or, vice versa, or the Dollies, or the what all the other ones that I'm getting. These particular ones might be power hungry, and so they might need more oomph, but that's not what's served by this. So I'm trying to really, that's the trick in doing a review like this is I want it to be accessible. I don't want to say, well, when I use this $5,000 amplifier that most of you aren't going to get, these speakers sounded good, because then, that's not what most people are going to do. But there is something to be said for, I think you alluded to this earlier. I don't know if you said this exactly, but when you're talking about the spend, then I think there is such a thing as matching. So what I mean by that is if you get let's say an amazing amplifier and crappy speakers, that's probably not as good as if you get, excellent speakers and a lesser amplifier. So if somebody had percentage wise, where would you put more of the budget? Or would you say as a rule to sort of match what the prices are?
Great question. It depends. So if we talk purely for a two-channel system here or a stereo system, then
Yeah.
I would say you would spend half the money. So if you're going to buy $2,000 speakers, you probably want to spend up to $1,000 on amplifiers, right? You can go a
Oh,
little bit,
okay.
yeah,
Half.
about half. You can go a little bit more, a little bit down. It really depends on your needs, but that's typically where a lot of folks spend their time. Where things get a little bit tricky is if you go into more separates, right? Because we're only talking about stereo amplifiers or integrated amplifiers. So integrated amplifiers means everything's built in. If you start to have a preamp and then a dedicated stereo amplifier, then it starts to build it up, right? Then 50% of your budget, would go towards the amplifier, but you still want to put probably another 25% or so to the integrated to make sure it has, excuse me, to the preamp to make sure it has all the connections that you're looking for. So you would spend, let's say, $2,000 on speakers, then probably another $750 on the amplifiers, and another, let's say, $500 or so on a preamp, right? Somewhere right in that ballpark. You can massage the numbers a little bit, but that's about where you want to be for those type of setups.
Okay, cool. I wanted to go back because there were a couple of things that, like, as you're saying them, I want to make sure that we clarify this. So you're talking a little bit about sensitivity and impedance. So these are numbers that are going to come up in the specs when you click on the speaker and specs. So we'll start with sensitivity. I've seen some sensitivities um, that go as low as 83 dBs. I don't
Yeah,
think I've seen anything too much lower than that. But essentially, when it says the sensitivity is low, that means it's harder to drive them. They need more power.
correct.
And so, what would you
Well,
say? 83 to high 80s is like tougher to drive?
yeah, most people will say anywhere in the 80s is harder to drive, 90s is easier. But I
Okay.
want to be clear. It's how much power you need to hit a certain SPL level, which comes me to a point I wanted to make as you were talking about the amplifiers and the different costs of them. You want to do something that's called level matching or volume matching, right? People use different terms for that. Are you familiar with that, Scott, or have we talked
I'm
about?
not.
Okay, so basically, it's very simple. Anyone can do this. You want to listen at the same SPL level in a room. So even your iPhone has like an SPL meter. However, you loud you like to listen, you want to make sure you level match it across the board. So let's say you like to listen at about 80 dB, right, which is pretty loud inside the room, right? So the sensitivity tells you, like, let's say something is 85 dB sensitivity of a speaker, how much watts you're going to need to produce, yeah, 80 dB of SPL in the room. Now, there's different mathematical formulas out there that we can get into, but basically, that's what it tells you to do. So when you're listening to these speakers, Scott, pull out an SPL meter, use the one on your phone, or there's like one for $20 off of Amazon you can get. Whatever your
Yeah.
comfortable volume listening level is, that's what you want to set it to every time before you start your critical listening. So you plug in the speakers, you say, I like to listen around 80 dB. You turn the volume knob or the gain knob up on your blue sound until you hit that volume level and you like it. Now, what people don't realize is that it's going to be different for every speaker based off of its sensitivity. So like for example, like let's say the volume knob goes from 1 to 10. Okay. You hypothetically can be at like a 4 and a 5 on a pair of clip speakers that have low sensitivity hitting 80 dB. But then because you have something that's harder to drive like the KEF, you might have to turn that volume knob up to a 6 or a 7 or even an 8 to get also 80 dB in the room. So you want to make sure you level match the speakers when you're listening, and then this way you can do your proper A/B testing. Because I don't want you in an experience where it's like, okay, you switch from one pair of speakers to the other, and you're like, oh man, these don't sound as loud, or they sound low, or they're doing different things, but you haven't level matched them yet to make sure they're up at the right way you like to listen. So now you'll be able to compare apples to apples. And I recommend people do this when they're demoing their speakers as well. Take an SPL meter, go into a showroom when you're talking to your local dealer and say, hey, this is how loud I like to listen to. So you want to make sure whatever speakers you're demoing, they're all level matched across the board.
I'm glad that you spelled that out because it turns out I actually have been doing that. I just didn't know that it was called something. I've done that with headphones and I've actually done that with portable speakers, like Bluetooth speakers, because speakers and headphones just behave differently at different volumes. And so
Yeah.
I want to make sure that I'm comparing them at, producing the same levels, because I've noticed that it's from headphone to headphone, even from music track to music track. There's some tracks that come on the radio that are just like, oh, wow, that's really loud. Let me turn that down. And other tracks are not as loud. So um, the apples to apples, that's one of the big challenges of an article like this. And I love the challenge of doing an article like this, but making sure that I'm comparing things as scientifically as possible. So I probably should get a sound meter and actually check that out. So how does that's with sensitivity? So the more the lower the number, the more it takes to drive them to that
Yeah.
same volume.
Yeah.
And then impedance is the opposite in the sense that the lower the impedance, the easier it is to drive. So can we talk for just a minute about how impedance factors in there?
So when we're talking about impedance, they're usually measured in ohms. And so just to kind of oversimplify this as well as the lower the impedance, the more current it's going to need to drive the speakers. And usually when people are putting out these numbers, it's an average, or sometimes they'll even push it as, hey, it's an 8 ohm speaker with a minimum of like 3.2 ohms. What that means is how much power it needs to control the speakers and drivers inside of the bookshelf speaker.
Yeah, I've seen that. I've seen it rated at a 4 ohm. I've seen it rated at 8 ohm. Sometimes it will say minimum impedance, but it's that basically it'll either say the word ohms or it'll have the little omega. And I always think it's interesting if you see something that has, um, I don't know, something that has like high sensitivity and also high impedance, like how those play off of each other, because it's kind of a push-pull thing, right?
It is, and it all goes down to whatever decisions the engineers made at the time of the design of the speakers, and how much and what type of performance they're looking for. But depending on the speaker specs, that's really going to determine what type of amplifier you get. And by the way, the ohm rating and sensitivity ratings, you got one pair of specs that exist on the company's website. But when you're talking about ohms and these sensitivities, they vary based off of what frequency range is being played out of the speaker. So when you're talking about 4 ohms, right, that usually means you need a lot more power because it's probably a three-way speaker and it's trying to push some LF drivers to create bass responses. Whereas a two-way speaker, you might see at 8 ohms because you really don't need the same type of power to deal with just a tweeter and a mid-range driver or mid-bass driver. So the speaker design also determines what's going to come from a impedance standpoint and a sensitivity standpoint.
Okay. And you've mentioned two-way and three-way a few times, and so I just want to make sure. I think you just said it, but when you're saying two-way, you just mean there's a tweeter and a woofer, and then three-way, it separates out essentially which speaker. There are three speakers handling different frequencies.
Correct, and it's based off crossover points. So inside of every speaker, there's always going to be crossovers, and just to simplify that process, is let's say the frequency range is from 0 to 100. The crossovers just tell you what is going to what individual driver. So the engineers usually set those. So let's say it says anything from 75 to 100 goes to the tweeter, and then anything from 75 and below goes to the mid-range and mid-bass. Because there's only one crossover point, it's a two-way speaker because you have two drivers in there. If you have a three-way design, then you get, let's say 75 to 100 goes towards the tweeter, 50 to 75 goes towards the mid-bass, and anything 50 and below goes to the low-frequency driver or the bass driver. So that's usually how you can tell the difference between a two-way and a three-way design, right? Don't forget there's single driver bookshelf speakers as well. Sometimes they're usually those are the smallest, but they're trying to push the entire frequency range through one driver. But that's exceptionally hard to do until you start to get really small, right? A lot of headphones, right? Headphones, they can be single driver headphones, and they're doing the entire
Yep.
frequency range. But that's what two-way and three-way typically mean. Sometimes there's even speakers out there that are four-way speakers, which means you have to look at the specs, but it'll usually be a tweeter, a mid-range, a mid-bass, and then a dedicated bass driver. And then that's a four-way speaker.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I've seen this in the world of headphones where you really can't assume like the more drivers the better, because then you have to deal with these crossover points of like how is it handing off this frequency and this point. And um, one of the things I've noticed is that uh, a feature in some powered speakers that I've looked into is that they have apps, and in the app you can actually say, "Here's where I want the crossover," like if you're adding a subwoofer, that kind of a thing.
Correct.
So I want to jump into, because we talked about the difference between passive speakers and powered speakers, but really like not all powered speakers are alike. And so folks in our audience, if you're looking for powered speakers, you might see some very different things. Um,
Correct.
so let's get into it. We alluded to the fact that sometimes there are going to be separate amplifiers for each driver. So I think that's an interesting thing to see. So it's like
Yeah.
there will be a separate built-in or integrated amplifier for the woofer and a separate integrated amplifier for the tweeter. And I think
That's
that
exactly right.
that kind of has something similar to do with the double binding post that we talked about, but it's just all built in and you don't have to worry about it.
Exactly. So when it comes to powered speakers, you just want to look at the specs. Like, do you want it to have wireless capabilities or Bluetooth capabilities? Do you want it to have a phono stage because you want to hook your turntable into it? You're just looking at all the specs that you need from a connectivity standpoint. And if you do want more bass, then yeah, does it have a subwoofer out? And are you able to set the crossover point? Typically, a good manufacturer will release their specs along with what the roll off points in. So they'll say something like it goes from 20 kilohertz all the way down to 40 hertz plus or minus 3 dB. The 40 hertz means that's when it kind of starts to roll off on the specs on what it can do, and it won't reproduce frequency well below that point. And that's where you'll kind of have a subwoofer coming in, where a subwoofer's like, okay, I do everything from 10 hertz all the way up to 100 hertz, and it's just very focused on that specific frequency range, and then you kind of set the crossovers into it, into the setup. Which, if I go back to another point that you said is, and way we talk about crossovers and integration, we will see that the more drivers you have in a speaker, the harder it can be to integrate into a room, right? Because LF drivers and low frequency drivers behave very differently. We didn't mention this before, but there's something called ports, which also live on speakers. There can be ports on the back of the speaker, on the front of the speaker, underneath it, on the sides, depending on the designs. And ports don't only exist for speakers, by the way, they also exist for subwoofers. Or it could be a completely closed design. That's going to determine where you can place the speakers into the room. So probably one of the biggest misconceptions is someone says, "Oh, I can have a bookshelf speaker and stick it in the corner of the room and it's going to sound great." And then you'll come to find out that the speaker you like has a rear port on it, which means you're probably going to have to put it, a little bit into a room, maybe even a foot into the room, so that it sounds really good. And all of a sudden, it's no longer like a bookshelf speaker that you kind of stick in a corner, but it's now more present inside of your room as you are doing your setup. But for considerations when it comes to active speakers, it's really all about, do you have the connections that you're looking for, and do you like the sound? Those are the main things.
Yeah, and I think that's a it's a very good point. I think we'll get into positioning a little bit later, but understanding that whole thing with roll off. So, some of the speakers that I'm seeing they'll say like they'll go down to something in the 60s, something maybe in the 40s to the 60s of hertz. And so it's not necessarily that like if two speakers look very similar, but one of them goes down to 60 hertz and the other one goes down to 63 hertz, it doesn't necessarily mean that the 60 hertz one is going to sound the best in your space with the best bass and all that. So it's just a lot of these numbers are guidelines. You should just know that like, if you see something that's only going down to 100 hertz, then you shouldn't expect to hear much bass. That's a lot of roll off. But if something is generally, I would say in the like 40 to 60 range for how low it can go, then it seems like it could be reasonable. And still, you probably want a subwoofer, but if you're just listening to music, you could probably also get away with something in that 40 to 60 hertz range, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And whether you're listening in a near field situation or if you've got a big room, that's probably one of the mistakes a lot of folks make is let's say they're in a big room with vaulted ceilings, and they have a family room that opens up into a dining room that opens up into a kitchen with these massive open floor plans. Then yeah, a bookshelf speaker, even if it gets down to 60 hertz or 40 hertz, will get lost in the room. So You just want to be realistic on the room, the environment where you're putting them to know exactly what type of speakers you want. And it doesn't even matter if it's a two-way speaker or a three-way speaker. It's just a matter of the volume in the room. And just another, kind of pro tip here for someone shopping is that a lot of people only look at the dimensions of the room from like, what's the length and the width. They always forget about the ceiling and the height of the room because you want to look at the total volume of the room, not just, oh, my room's only 10 square feet. I was like, but if you've got 30-foot vaulted ceilings, it makes a really big difference inside of that room. Those are the type of things you want to take into consideration when you're thinking about what type of setup you want, and what type of bookshelf speaker you're looking for.
Yeah, and honestly, I'm a little bit scared because my main room that I'm sitting in right now is what I think is very not ideal. It's very wide, it's fairly shallow, and very high ceilings. So the sound on the sides has nothing to bounce off of. There's not a lot of room for me to bring the speakers into the room,
Yeah.
and then there's a lot of ways for these vaulted and angled ceilings for the sound to get lost. So I'm gonna have to find some other spaces to test these speakers in when I start getting the actual speakers in, once I've narrowed down my list. Um, so I'm keeping all of this stuff in mind.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think you should test it out in both those scenarios because your living room might be close to something that somebody else has. I think this is also a good point to make is that all the specs we're seeing are in the most ideal situation, right? These companies are, publishing their specs after measuring everything in multi-million dollar anechoic chambers, which are designed to perfectly do measurements and to see what the speakers perform like, and it's a purely engineering task. So that's where I don't know if you want to go down the article, but if you get something like Dirac or Odyssey or doing RAW and measuring your room and measuring how the speakers are interacting in your room, that level of DSP can really help tone make a speaker that's kind of sounding meh in your environment to sounding really, really good. I use Dirac in my home theater and I will swear by it. I absolutely love it. And I know they have a two-channel setup as well to where they can deal with
Yeah.
stereo and what they're dealing with subwoofer integration. But don't be afraid of the DSP settings. Most powered speakers or active speakers will come with an app with DSP, like you said. But sometimes when you go to the passive side, you'll have to do a little bit more legwork on your setup to make sure that it's really refined in the room the way you like it.
Yeah, and that's it's one of the things that's gonna probably make the difference in especially which amp. I think the Winamp Ultra has some of that sound correction built in, and there were some speakers, I think they were Klipsch, that also came with some sort of room correction license and so forth. So,
Yeah,
room correction is another big deal, and I don't wanna get into it too much here, but the main thing to consider with speakers is like, how do they sound in your room? Because they can sound great in 10 other rooms. They can sound great in the showroom. If they don't sound great in your room, they're not worth your money.
exactly.
Um, I wanted to get into when we're talking about um, when we're talking about powered speakers, I just want to make sure we get into like what people are likely to see. So when you're looking at power speakers, active speakers, one of the things you're likely to see is that they're going to be somewhere each of the speakers has power coming into it, and then there's some like that you have to plug them into the wall, and then some speakers are powered and you put power into the primary speaker, and then the other one, the secondary speaker, has some sort of a connection, and sometimes it's
Yeah.
USB-C, sometimes it's like an ethernet network cord. So from the sense of both power and sound, can you go over like are there any differences that I should know about as I'm looking at this, like, especially in my testing? Like, what's the big difference of if they're both powered versus if they're powered in this sort of daisy chain kind of setup?
Great question. So It's just a matter of how good the speakers are going to sound in the room, right? Just because you have a set of speakers that are independently powered versus the daisy chain doesn't necessarily mean one is going to be better than the other one. It's just how well engineered it is. And I'm glad you brought up that point because one thing to consider on the active speaker side is if they are daisy chained, how far apart can you actually put those speakers? Because if you're on a desktop setup, they're probably not going to be more than 5, maybe at most 6 feet apart. But when you're talking a living room setup and you might want to hide the cables and go, underneath a carpet or go around a fireplace or whatever the setup looks like, you want to take that into consideration as well for a powered setup. Independently plugged just makes it easier because if you plug them independently and they're wireless between the speakers, I mean, it's a clean setup. It's easy. It's plug and play. One of the sides should have all the inputs. But if they're daisy chained together, or there needs to be an Ethernet between them or a USB between them, that's going to make a big difference. The other thing is if it's purely wireless, you want to look at whatever limitations it has on the bit rate and sampling rate. So to make things stable, wireless speakers where they're wireless between the left and the right speaker might be going wireless at a lower bit rate, like let's say 44.116. But when you plug them in and you have that USB-C cable between them or Ethernet cable between them, that's when you get full, true, high resolution 192.24 bit. That's something you might want to keep into consideration as well.
Yeah. So it's another trade-off of convenience for quality.
Yeah.
Um,
And then you
but
just
yeah, I
have to be
think
realistic with your sources as well, right? Because I see so many people that are looking and playing this numbers game, and I'm sure you see it on the headphone side of like, do you have 192.24, going all the way up into the 700s, but at the same time you're like, my friend, you only listen to Spotify, like you're not even utilizing the high resolution. Or you get someone who's really into high resolution but then are limiting it because they don't want to have a speaker wire in between the left and right speaker, and everything's getting downsampled anyways.
yeah, there's a lot of stuff like that where it seems like people aren't paying attention to the right thing. It's like imagine if you had this amazing car stereo system with 12 speakers and all this, and it's super fancy, and then you drive with the windows open all the time. Like you're not catching, you're not going to get
Yeah.
the whole fanciness and the great sound quality that you just paid for. And I think there are a lot of ways that people do that with headphones, with speakers in the house, where you know these are capable, but how you're setting it up is really affecting that. So I think we should talk a little bit more about. Let's get into positioning, and you mentioned like the distance from the wall if there's a ported speaker. I think one of the things I've seen in my research is that there's some speakers, and I've seen YouTube where they actually compare having it like right up against the wall, like a foot away, and then even 3 feet into the room. And if you wear good quality headphones while listening to this particular video, it's audible. Like I could hear it, and I'm not a super expert when it comes to this stuff, but I could hear that there was a sound because he recorded it, this binaural recording, having microphones like where somebody's ears would be, and I could hear that the characteristics were like that the vocals just sounded more present. It sounded like it was almost like if a speaker were on stage and then came and walked right up to your seat. Like you can hear the difference in that.
Yeah, and so positioning, it makes a big difference in any audio setup. And the main part is what is somebody like? And there's different port sizes on the back of each speaker. There's ports on the front of each speaker. So distance from the front wall, from the side wall, distance from the floor. People always forget about the floor, but you're having sound that's bouncing off the floor if they're on stands, or if you're putting them on your entertainment center. A lot of people have them like recessed back on the entertainment center. Really, you want to push them forward so you don't get that immediate reflection off of a hard surface of your console there. So all these things come into play on how well the speakers are going to perform in the room. But at the same time, is people want to listen to it in one setup where they may like it, and spend some time in just one particular setup, one particular position inside the room, see how you like it. If you don't like it, then we want to narrow down why you don't like it. Do you feel like the bass is too boomy? Well, if the bass feels too boomy for you, that means it's too close to the wall. You want to might start moving it out. Or if you feel like the bass is a little bit lacking, then you might want to move it a little bit closer to the wall so you get the back wall to reinforce that low frequency a little bit, and you may like it. There's something called a null, which might be new for some of our listeners here, but a null is where you get the left and right speaker are hitting a perfect sine wave right where you are sitting, and it's canceling out certain frequencies. And so when you're in your listening position, you think everything's set up great, and you're like, man, this bass isn't hitting, or this, I'm not hearing the cymbals like I used to. And then you move 2 feet to your left, and everything sounds fantastic. It means you've created a null in your setup in your system there, where certain frequencies are clashing with each other. So then you want to play with whether you're going to toe in the speakers, how much do you toe them in, whether you're going to have them straight on. You'll have some speakers that have really wide off axis response, which means they're a lot more flexible on toe in and facing forward. Or you might have some speakers that have some really narrow off axis response, which means you might end up towing them in a lot, putting them further apart. So when someone is positioning the speakers in the room, put them where you think they should go first and see how they sound. And once they don't sound right to you, then you start to decide whether you're going to pull them out, push them in, move them further apart, put them closer together, and then you start to play with what you like in the room. And again, if you download something like REW, which is free, if you set that up, you can actually measure it in your room to see how the speakers are performing. And then you'll have data that you could put up on the forum or put up in a chat and find out where people are like, okay, if you're having a problem with a specific frequency range, then here's how you can potentially solve that.
So you mentioned a few things. I think let's start from the very basics. What I've heard is that there's generally a triangle. There's all sorts of the rules of this number and that number, but essentially you want to have the speakers at the same distance apart as you're going to be listening from the speakers. Is that what the triangle is?
That's what most people say, but that's very hard to do unless you're building a dedicated room.
And then you mentioned the terms towing in, towing out, on axis, off axis. Can you just briefly explain what that means?
Yes, I can. So when the speakers are, let's say you put the speakers in the room and you're pointing them like straight ahead. Like I'll put up some pictures so you can see what straight ahead speakers look like. When you start to toe them in, it's exactly like it starts to sound. You start to turn the speakers inward so they're facing more and more towards the listening area or wherever you're seated. That's where you're towing in. When you're talking about off-axis response, there's a particular bandwidth where the speakers will sound the best, or a particular range. So if you're like right in front of the speakers, they typically sound the best. So if you toe them in a lot, you're getting pretty much where the center of the speaker is, pointed towards the listening area. That's where it sounds really good. The minute you start to move to your left or your right, and let's say the front of the speaker is kind of pointed towards your left shoulder, now you're moving off axis. And so it doesn't matter which way you move off axis, it can sound different each time. Now, off axis, a lot of people talk about it left and right, but the height matters as well. One of the big tips you'll see is people say try to put the tweeter at ear level as a starting point. Sometimes you might want to move the tweeter slightly above ear level when you're sitting, or maybe slightly below, depending on the reflections you're getting off of the floor and sometimes even the ceilings. So these are all the little nuanced things you want to take into consideration as you're setting up the bookshelf speakers in your room. I should actually point out this affects floor standing speakers as well. All these tips apply to pretty much any speakers, but for the purposes of our conversations, and bookshelf speakers, all this makes a difference. So when you're buying stands, make sure you get the stands that you like that puts the speakers exactly as close to ear level as possible, and then with the ability to adjust it up or down a little bit so you can really lock in that sound stage that you're looking for.
Yeah, it's another. The more you talk, the more I get both excited and scared of doing all this testing. So I need to find some speaker stands. It might be more than one that there are such thing as adjustable speaker stands. They might go from whatever 29 to 43 inches, something like that. But it is very important because you really just hit on like two or three super important things that totally change the listening experience. One was I'd say one of the top ones is the height, making sure that the height of the speaker, specifically the tweeter speaker, the little 1 inch, it's usually around 1 inch, the height of that is going to affect a lot of what you hear, because it's more directional. And so it matters that it's at the same height as your ear, based on where you're most likely to be listening. Probably a couch, love seat, something like that. Um, but there's not a perfect one because you could have bookshelf speakers and just be walking around the room and the speakers aren't going to follow you. So it's really, um, ultimately it would be nice to have forgiving speakers. And I think there are different, I don't know if you covered this, but different speakers have kind of different angles that they're known for producing sound.
Yeah, that's that off access response. Um,
Yeah.
Yeah, difference be like Kef is the one that comes to mind, or ELAC, right? These have wide off-axis responses on their speakers, and it all depends on the type of design as well of the speaker. So just because the speaker has a good off-axis response doesn't mean it's going to behave well in the room, anyways. But these are all like starting points and metrics for folks. I'll give you actually another pro tip here, and I think this won't have too much of an effect on you and what you're trying to do, Scott. But if someone is upgrading speakers, just remember if you're going from like a two-way speaker to a three-way speaker, they're going to behave very differently. And if you've already gone through the trouble of putting up acoustical panels and different things like that to control the room, putting in a pair of new speakers doesn't necessarily mean the new speakers are going to sound good in the same position as your old speakers. You might have to change them around or change where you put the acoustical panels in your room to make sure things sound better and appropriate.
Yeah, definitely. So we've talked a little bit about some of the mistakes people can make. Where would you say are kind of diminishing returns? Like, I want people to really get a sense of where should I focus my energy when I'm doing my research. I'm looking at bookshelf speakers. Like, what's some of the stuff that I can maybe pay less attention to?
Great question. So the thing that you want to quote unquote pay less attention to is some of the official measurements online. The way I look at a lot of these measurements is a speaker manufacturer will say our speaker can perform with specific measurements. Then you'll find amazing publications like Soundstage, which will go out and measure the speakers just to make sure they actually match up. So whatever the manufacturer is advertising, that their lab independently is testing it and saying, "Yep, the manufacturer didn't lie to you." Um, the those measurements and those speaker tests and some of those things that you might see online from a really technical standpoint, you can start to ignore some of those once you feel like the manufacturer isn't lying to you. Because just because a speaker measures well doesn't mean you're going to like the way they sound. Doesn't mean they're going to sound good in your room. So start to pay less attention to some of those stats and pay more attention to your ears and what you like to listen to and what sounds good to you. Right? Like we talked about before, like people use even different materials. Do you like an aluminum tweeter? Do you like a beryllium tweeter? Do you like a titanium tweeter? All these things have different characteristics that might sound very harsh to someone, but might sound really sweet to someone else. So both sets of speakers can measure pretty great in the room and may even measure very similar on their independent test. But until you get ears on with them, you're not going to know which ones you actually like.
Yeah, and there are a lot of marketing terms, and I'm guilty of being a marketer and hate certain marketing terms because they're so nondescript. You know, it's like I buy oatmeal. It's like, oh, there's steel cut oats. Oh, that's great. Why is that great? I don't know. I don't know what that means. I don't know why steel cutting it would make a difference as
Yeah.
opposed to what? Paper cut?
Yeah.
Laser cut?
There
Like
you go.
it's oatmeal. So I don't really know at this point if I like paper tweeters or aluminum tweeters or like what all that is. I might have a different sense of it once I get all these speakers in and actually get to listen to them side by side. But um, yeah, that's a good one. I guess in terms of the side by side, I'm just going to put you on the spot here. So CE Critic scores. When we start talking about bookshelf speakers, then what are you seeing? Is there anything you're seeing in terms of brands that tend to come up? Are there certain places like that you would start to say like, oh, you should start looking at these three brands or something that are pretty well regarded?
Yeah.
What are the
That's
statistics telling you?
Yeah, I mean there's a lot of good speakers out there. And you really want to just look at the brands, you want to look at the lineage of the brands and kind of the reputation in the market. But just to name a few that people can look at, I mean, you've got companies like Bowers and Wilkins, you've got Focal, we've mentioned Klipsch earlier, we've mentioned Kef, you've got ELAC, you've got Monitor Audio. There's a lot of great brands out there that are building amazing bookshelf speakers. So, one of the things I'll say here, and another mistake that people make is they kind of rush to buy bookshelf speakers. But if you can take your time and demo the speakers and make sure you're picking the ones you really like, that's going to result in the best experience possible.
Yeah, and I feel good about the fact that most of the actually all the ones that you mentioned are ones that are on my list to consider. And when I'm writing these articles, I loved if I'm writing about 10 products, it's not usually 10, but if I'm writing about 10, I kind of like 8 of them to be pretty well known. And I like to have like one or two that are just like, oh, I hadn't heard about that one. There's this company in France that makes bookshelf speakers that I've never heard of, but if they're being included in this, then I would give them a listen. And I look at that as one of my jobs as a journalist because the thing I can't stand as a journalist is when it says like, here are the best sound bars or here are the best earbuds or here are the best headphones. If I can tell you what's on the list before reading the article, I consider it not a good article. It doesn't make it that I'm smart. It means like, oh, you're going to mention this exact model, this exact brand for this because everybody else says it. So you're going to say it. So I try for my articles to not do that. I like for some of it to be familiar and in that kind of 4-to-1 ratio of like, oh, there's this interesting thing I hadn't heard of, and now I can inform my decision better.
No, that makes perfect sense. I was going to say these are like a lot of the brands I've listened to. Like two that I really want to get hands on with. Maybe you've already listened to these are Arendelle speakers. They're coming up pretty heavy in a lot of my conversations and what I'm seeing out in the market and what we're pulling into CE Critic, as well as ProListen. These are two brands I really want to get hands on with because they seem to be new darlings inside the industry that people are really enjoying.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of those. I'm just hearing about them now. So now I've got something I'm getting out of the episode that I'll definitely want to reach out to them. One of the things I want to get back to that actually ties in with your top story is I know one big use case for bookshelf speakers is people who are into vinyl. And so I wanted to talk about like what do they need to look for in bookshelf speakers because there's a certain kind of amplifier, there's certain kind of power requirements. So if somebody wants to hook their record player up to bookshelf speakers, what do they need to know? Because I've heard about staging and preamps and all that, and it seems like it's easy to get tricked or it's easy to think you're getting something, but then it doesn't work.
Yeah, you have to look at the phono stage of the speaker, or usually on an integrated amplifier, they'll be really good about it. But you want to look to see if it has a phono stage or not. If it has a phono stage, you should be good with most turntables out there. And then the other thing is whatever type of cartridge you're using, whether you're using a moving magnet cartridge or a moving coil, whichever one you're using, you want to make sure you really hone in on that piece of the chain, and that's really it.
So I've seen that before where it says like mm.
Or MC.
So like if it says mm versus coil, so what does somebody need to look for in the speakers?
So some speakers will have a switch where it'll say, you have a switch on the back where you can toggle between or MC depending on what type of cartridge they're using. Or they'll say they do it internally digitally where there's a lot of opportunity there as well. So as long as they can handle both, if it can only handle one or the other or it's not clear, then yeah, reach out to the manufacturer or expand your research and make sure it matches what you like and what you're looking to do when you're listening to a turntable.
So what other are there any other features of bookshelf speakers that we haven't already covered?
Yes, and I think one really important thing that I want to mention here is believe the ears. You're going to be a lot of people that tell you you're doing it wrong. But if you like the way it sounds, just enjoy it. And watch the slippery slope of improvements because you can easily go from, hey, I was going to spend $1,000 on a pair of speakers, and you can probably get some really damn good bookshelf speakers, to all of a sudden, why am I spending $5,000 on a pair of bookshelf speakers? Is there going to be an improvement? Yes. Is that improvement going to be worth it? That is purely subjective. The one question I see all the time that no one can answer is, if I spend $500 more, am I going to get a better speaker? Objectively, probably something that measures a little bit better, has a little bit tighter control on the bass, maybe even better components inside, better crossover components, better resistors. Doesn't mean it sounds better. That's going to come to you in your ears. And another thing that I would bring up, and this is getting into a little bit more on the audiology side, which is people are not accurate on what they can listen to. There's reviewers out there who openly and publicly state what frequency ranges they can hear because they go to an audiologist, they get their test. But there's a lot of reviewers out there that don't. So listen to your own two ears and not just what is out there from some publications, because some of those guys can't hear as good as you think they can.
Yeah, I mean that's a big mistake to just assume that your ears are like my ears or that you like what I like. There are some times where I like a lot of detail and it's a balancing act because I do like a lot of detail, but like I am not an ASMR guy. I don't like a lot of sibilance, and so I'm sensitive to that. So I'm always, especially in the high end with the treble, I'm always walking a very fine line of like this sounds I'd like it to sound bright and open, but there's a level where I go, yeah, I'd rather take less and not feel like I'm about to cringe every time I hear hi-hats and stuff like that.
Excellent. So, what are your plans now? Do you think you're going to, for your article with Business Insider, do you think you're going to get a subwoofer with it, or are you just going to test out just the two speakers or two channel
I'm
audio?
toying with it, because that's a question. My question to you, I'll turn it back to you. If I do, then what do I do? Because I'm not going to get, like each company, SVS and KEF and whatever, have very well regarded subwoofers. So then, I guess is generic advice. Do you have generic advice about matching up a subwoofer that's a universal subwoofer that would work well with all bookshelf speakers?
I mean, they mostly do. Subwoofers inherently can be pretty universal. It's probably one of the few areas inside your system where you can really mix and match. So if you do like, the KEF bookshelf speakers, but you want to put an SVS subwoofer, that's pretty common, right? A lot of people do that. Doesn't mean the KEF ones are bad. It just means, different price points, different performances. I would say whatever subwoofer you pick, um, use the same one throughout the entire setup and use the
Yeah.
same crossover point in the entire setup, right? And
Mm.
make sure that stays pretty consistent across the board. If you want to play with the crossover point just for your own, you have your third glass of wine and you're just sitting there messing with your system, makes sense. But I would say for the review purposes, you probably want to have those matched as best as possible across the board. And I'm always a fan of subwoofers, by the way. Even if you have a three-way speakers, still get a subwoofer. it will enhance the experience completely.
That's interesting that you say to have the same crossover point because the speakers are differently capable, like we just said. So you're saying essentially find a common denominator. So if a speaker goes down to 43 hertz and another one goes down to 60 hertz, then you would say make it whatever. If I have the crossover point as 80 hertz, then that would account for both. That I don't want to favor one or the other.
Yeah,
So I want to make sure that whatever the crossover point is, it's above whatever the lowest point is of all the speakers, right?
that's what I would recommend.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm trying to it's the similar thing with the amplifier thing where I'm thinking like what are most people going to do? And I don't want to judge all the sound. I also don't want to have to judge it for like 10 sets of speakers 5 different times. It's like I'm judging in this room from this angle with this source. But it's going to be a lot. So that's why like I'm working on this now. We're recording in March and the article's not going to come out until May because it takes that long to do the research and then to I've mostly sourced a lot of the speakers. So as soon as I have my final list, I would say within a week or so, maybe 2 weeks tops, I would have all the speakers and I probably want to keep it to 10 or 12 total because um I can't it's going to be different categories, so there's going to be like a best value speaker, best premier speaker, best passive, best powered, best streaming speaker. Like I haven't even worked out what the categories are going to be, but I can't presume that this is the best and then I'm just going to listen to it and say, yes, confirming my choice is the best. Like I need to compare it to something else. So the next order for me is uh, to make a list. I'm going to put this into a spreadsheet for my editor. We're going to go back and forth a few times about
Okay,
what the categories are based on what I found. And once we come up with that, then I send out a bunch of emails to the people I've already contacted in the past few weeks and get these speakers in and start listening to them.
excellent. That sounds like a tough job. I'm being a little facetious, but I know it's a lot of work. But man, just it's got to be fun listening side by side with all these different types of gear and equipment.
Yeah, I mean, there's a fun aspect to it, and I love the organizational part of thinking like you said, like how am I going to test this consistently and make sure that I'm being fair and make sure that I'm considering actual use cases, like my use case with what other people might be in a different kind of a use case. Maybe they're in a one room and I'm in kind of an open floor plan here. And so somebody else might not have an open floor plan. So I love what this is all about for me for a buyer's guide is I want somebody to read this article and feel like I feel completely prepared to buy bookshelf speakers. The intimidation is gone. I know what I need to know and I can now navigate. It's almost like giving somebody a map. It's like now I can navigate all the little niggles of what kinds of speakers there are, what connections I'm going to see, what specs I'm going to see, and I'll know what that all means and I'll know how I want to go through and they'll probably still have questions. I guess that'll be an interesting thing once we start doing live stuff again, or we have special member only listening things that people are going to be able to call us. But the benefit of putting this out there now is that folks who are watching can actually put stuff in the comments and ask us questions, and we'll do our best to get back.
Absolutely, I think that's the perfect segue, for wrapping up this show. I mean, this was a really fun conversation. It went a little bit longer than we normally do, and just as you guys are noticing, episode 3 here, we made a little bit of a shift from going live to doing pre-recorded. So tell us what you guys think. Did we cover this topic fully? Did we give you guys enough information? Anything we missed? Any bits of other information you would want to add here? Leave your comments below. Tell us what you guys think. We're constantly looking at all of that, and we'd love to hear your feedback. As we're growing here and getting better, next week we're actually going to have our first guest on the show. So, Scott, you want to talk a little bit more about that and what we have planned for our next episode?
Sure. We're going to have a guest, Adam Dowd. He's a fellow freelance journalist. He has a lot of bylines. He writes all over the place, and we'll get into those. He also has a podcast, and we're going to get into an interesting topic, what I think is an interesting topic. And based on what people ask me when I tell them what I do, I think people will be really into it. It's all about press trips and review samples and some of the ethics behind being a technology journalist. So you were just saying like, oh, it's a tough job. Yeah, it's a tough job having $50,000 worth of stuff sent to me. In that way, I get it, but there's still things I have to consider.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there are going to be some people who very much want the speakers back, and there are going to be some companies who really don't care if they send them back. And then what happens? What do I do with those? Do I give them away as gifts? Do I sell them? What's the right thing to do? And with press trips, like how does being taken onto a press trip and having all my accommodations paid for, how does that affect me? Does it or doesn't it? And how does it affect me? So we're going to talk with Adam because he actually does way more traveling than I do, and he writes a lot more than I do, and he gets faced with a lot more of this stuff. And I've experienced some of it. I've certainly gone on some interesting press trips, and I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with Adam next week. It's going to be a different vibe as we go into episode 4.
I think so, and I'm really excited about this too. I mean, the last couple of episodes, I know I've been talking quite a bit, but I'm really excited because I've got a lot of questions for you too on this experience. Because I've done it from the manufacturer side to where I've set all these up, but to get your guys' perspective from the press and journalist side, I'm excited for this conversation. So
Definitely.
so that wraps it up. Don't forget to like, subscribe, ring that bell. We really appreciate you guys joining us. Leave your comments below, and we will catch you guys in the next one.
All right. And thanks for being a part of the Tech Collective.